Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at an extremely fast gaming monitor, the Asus ROG Swift Pro PG248QP, which pushes up to a massive 540Hz refresh rate. As the name kind of implies, this ROG Swift Pro monitor is designed for professional esports gamers, although it does serve as a nice proof of concept for the future of high performance, high refresh rate displays that will hopefully become more accessible over the next few years. Currently, if you want a 500Hz plus monitor, it's LCD panels that are providing that, with either IPS or TN technology offering those kind of speeds. Asus have opted for what they describe as an eTN panel for this monitor, or eSports TN, which they claim is the world's fastest TN panel that is approximately 50% more responsive than traditional TN panels. We already know that TN are the fastest type of LCDs available, so it makes sense to use this type of panel in a performance-focused display, even if that means sacrificing a bit from color quality and viewing angles. As far as specifications go, this display features a 24.1-inch 1920 by 1080 TN panel with 540Hz achievable through an overclocking feature in the OSD. It includes a G-Sync module from NVIDIA, so we get adaptive sync support, as well as ultra-low motion blur 2 technology and the reflex analyzer, which we've covered in videos previously. Asus have also listed display HDR 400 support, although actual HDR hardware support is somewhere between limited and non-existent. Coming in at $900 US, I don't really expect Asus to sell very many of these, outside of a select few multiplayer gamers that want to try it out and have cash to burn. Instead, I think the primary goal of this monitor is to prove that 500Hz is possible and worth having, as well as to provide a bit of a halo effect for other Asus monitors. Before getting into the usual stuff, let's talk briefly about the refresh rate, because there's more than meets the eye here. Firstly, 540Hz is only supported in the very latest builds of Windows 11. As it turns out, previous iterations of Windows capped out at 500Hz, so if you want to access the top-end capabilities of this monitor, you'll need to ensure you're running the latest version of Windows. Not a big deal for most gamers, but there are some holdouts using Windows 10 and older versions of the OS that won't be possible in the 500Hz plus era. Also, 540Hz compatibility I found to differ between NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, which could be a result of the use of NVIDIA's proprietary G-Sync hardware module, which is really designed with the primary goal of working with NVIDIA graphics cards. Basically, if you have an NVIDIA GPU, nothing to worry about, 540Hz works with full variable refresh rate support up to that maximum. With an AMD GPU, 540Hz also works, but you won't get variable refresh rate support at that maximum. Even if everything appears enabled, the monitor remains capped at 540Hz as indicated by its built-in refresh rate counter. It's only at 500Hz and below that you will get full VRR support. Not the biggest deal, 540Hz versus 500Hz is just an 8% difference, but it's something to be aware of. As for the benefits of the refresh rate itself, you'll see how it impacts motion clarity a bit later, but just using this monitor for desktop apps, it's a massive step up for responsiveness and smoothness over most typical refresh rates of today. Going from 144Hz to 540Hz is night and day. I know some people believe that anything above 144Hz is diminishing returns. I disagree. Even for something as simple as browsing the web and navigating through Windows, 540Hz is significantly smoother, and any action you take or input from your mouse feels near instantaneous in a way that becomes crystal clear when returning back to the much slower world of 144Hz. I also think it's quite a noticeable upgrade over 240Hz. The refresh rate here is more than doubled, which leads to a corresponding improvement to latency. Obviously, less of a gain than from 144Hz, but when comparing 540Hz to 240Hz, I think the weaknesses in 240Hz become more apparent than when that refresh rate first debuted. The only real way to describe it is that 240Hz feels slower to use than 540Hz, though it's probably not enough of a benefit to justify the astronomical price increase to access 540Hz. The PG248QP uses a similar design to previous Asus ROG monitors of this size, especially for the display section. Most of the outer surfaces are a simple grey plastic, and while it's quite well put together, the overall build quality is not quite where it needs to be for a $900 1080p monitor. It's really nothing special. The rear panel design is very gamery, and it uses an RGB LED illuminated ROG logo that we've seen across many monitors over the last few years. It's not bad or anything, but these days we are seeing better and more useful LED integrations into premium monitors. The unique and interesting aspect to this design is the new base, which is adjustable between a wider setup and a more closed setup. The thinking here is that esports gamers often like to use some pretty unconventional keyboard and mouse positions, so having this level of adjustability caters to many different types of gamer. It's a smooth and straightforward transition between the two positions, and you can set any position between the two maximums as well. What was good to see is this unique base design doesn't compromise on the stability of the monitor. It's a rock solid build that also includes full ergonomic adjustability for the display itself. All of height, tilt, swivel, and pivot is included here. However, as it uses a G-Sync hardware module, it does include active cooling with a slow spinning fan that's audible at close range. You might be able to hear it in a dead quiet room, but I found it very difficult to hear over my PC's quiet fans during normal operation. The good news is that the fan didn't ramp up and down aggressively during my time testing it. It's those changes in speed and volume that are the most noticeable and most annoying. This fan is just a constant low speed that's near inaudible, so it's basically a non-issue. The G-Sync module continues to have limited connectivity options, packing one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and two HDMI 2.0 ports, as well as a 2-port USB hub. The DisplayPort is fine, but the use of HDMI 2.0 on an expensive 540Hz display is not good enough, as it limits those ports to just 240Hz, less than half of the maximum. I suspect most people will be hooking up over DisplayPort, but still, it's really about time the G-Sync module is updated to support HDMI 2.1 so that all ports are full refresh rate ports. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle and includes a strong feature set, including many gaming-specific features like crosshairs, timers, a shadow boosting mode, and so on. Interesting that a monitor targeting professional gamers includes crosshair support. Is that considered cheating? If you're a pro gamer, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, in addition to that, we get the Reflex Analyzer, which if you're using an NVIDIA GPU can be used to assess total system latency, a handy inclusion for optimizing your setup to minimize latency that doesn't require external latency measuring hardware and produces more accurate results than PC-side latency tools. Time to look at response time performance, and the PG248QP includes 4 overdrive settings, the first of which is off, which looks like this. Actually quite a good result for no overdrive. This would beat most other monitors with overdrive enabled. But for 540Hz gaming, I think most people will want to use the normal mode at a minimum. And this is what the normal mode looks like. It's incredibly fast. With just a 1.8 millisecond average response time and next to no overshoot, the PG248QP is highly suited to playing at 540Hz with refresh compliance at 86%. Often the concern with these super high refresh rate monitors is that the transition speed isn't fast enough to keep up with the refresh rate, but that absolutely isn't the case here, even with our relatively strict measurement criteria. This leads to very low cumulative deviation for an LCD. There are 2 other modes available. One is esports, which slightly improves the average response to 1.6 milliseconds, but also slightly increases overshoot. Visually, this mode isn't all that different to normal, and the cumulative deviation numbers are close. Then we have the extreme mode, which pushes up to 1.2 milliseconds on average, but does so at a much higher level of overshoot, so I wouldn't recommend using this mode. What's great to see is that the normal mode, which I believe is ideal for 540Hz gaming, is also excellent across the entire refresh rate range thanks to variable overdrive. There's really no refresh rate where this display performs poorly. At 360Hz it comes in at 1.9 milliseconds, 240Hz 2.3 milliseconds, 144Hz 2.5 milliseconds, and 60Hz 2.5 milliseconds as well, with basically no overshoot at any point. Overdrive isn't quite as aggressive at these lower refresh rates, which is why we go from 1.8 milliseconds down to 2.5 milliseconds at the lower parts of the range, but either way, this is excellent performance that gives us an elite tier single overdrive mode experience. Compared to other monitors, the PG248QP is the fastest LCD that I've tested to this point. It's 0.5 milliseconds faster than the PG27AQN at its highest refresh rate, and over 50% faster than the XL2566K at a lower level of overshoot, confirming Asus claims about an approximately 50% more responsive experience than traditional TN panels. And these are some of the fastest monitors going around. Relative to a more standard 240Hz IPS to even some older TN displays, the PG248QP is over twice as fast in both refresh rate and response time. However, overall, OLEDs are still faster, holding about a 6 times advantage, though no OLED is available at 540Hz. Average performance is also very good from this Asus monitor, again confirming its position as the fastest LCD that I've tested. It's 33% faster on average than the PG27AQN and achieves this at a lower level of overshoot, which is extremely impressive and shows that TN still has a place in the market for extreme speed. It's also a clear step ahead of the BenQ XL2566K, which is expected from a newer generation of panel, but perhaps not to this degree, and pretty much anything that's not 360Hz or above has no hope of competing outside of OLEDs. Average cumulative deviation also shows the strength of the PG248QP and its strong combination of speed and lack of overshoot. We're still seeing a 31% gap between the PG248QP and PG27AQN and a 50% advantage over the XL2566K. Even at the exact same 360Hz refresh rate comparing best versus best overdrive settings, the PG248QP produced a 39% better cumulative deviation result than the XL2566K, and combined with the PG248QP's better tuning at lower refresh rates, we see a quite sizable overall win to the Asus model. However, we are still a fair way off from LCDs matching OLEDs. A typical OLED panel has a 5x advantage in this metric over the fastest LCD, so it's still the case that an OLED at a lower refresh rate can match an LCD at a higher refresh rate in motion clarity. They can't close the gap between 240Hz and 540Hz though, despite their speed. I don't think 120Hz gaming is the target market for this monitor, but the PG248QP performs well there regardless. This is also a great monitor for 60Hz gaming if you happen to need this level of speed at a low refresh rate. One of the big selling points to the PG248QP in addition to the 540Hz refresh rate is support for backlight strobing through NVIDIA ULMB 2. The integration into this monitor is a little more compatible than with the PG27AQN, as it does work with both AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, on NVIDIA GPUs at multiple refresh rates and on AMD GPUs at 540Hz. This is because, as I said earlier, enabling 540Hz on an AMD GPU stops adaptive sync from working, and ULMB2 requires adaptive sync to be disabled for it to function at all. So there's a small amount of good news there for AMD gamers that want to pair this display with their GPU. For NVIDIA GPU owners, there's greater compatibility and support for multiple refresh rates, although you'll still need to use ULMB2 at fixed refresh rates, and there's a surprisingly limited range of choices. ULMB2 only works down to 360Hz. At 240Hz and lower refresh rates, the option is grayed out, in comparison to the PG27AQN that supported it down to 144Hz. BenQ's XL2566K with DIAC Plus works down to 100Hz. So if you wanted to utilize the middle part of the refresh range and backlight strobing simultaneously, say your game doesn't run at 500 FPS on your GPU, then you'd be much better off with the XL2566K instead. When you can enable it, the motion clarity provided by the PG248QP and ULMB2 is superior to that of the BenQ XL2566K using DIAC Plus both at their maximum refresh rate, 540Hz and 360Hz respectively. The PG248QP has slightly less strobe crosstalk and a slightly clearer image, although both are great. When turning the PG248QP down to 360Hz to get a matched refresh rate comparison, the gap narrows between the two models, but I'd still give the overall edge in clarity to the PG248QP. It really does have excellent motion clarity that would have to be the best that I've seen. Anything below this refresh rate, the BenQ wins by default, as it actually supports strobing at those refreshes. But the benefit of the PG248QP extends beyond backlight strobing, as the non-strobed 540Hz image is also incredibly impressive in terms of clarity. Comparing the 540Hz image here to 360Hz, whether from the XL2566K or the PG248QP turned down to 360Hz, the 540Hz image is noticeably sharper and less blurry. The text, for example, while not crystal clear, is more readable on the 540Hz image. Compared to 240Hz, the difference in blurriness is very obvious in favor of 540Hz. The ULMB2 implementation also supports different strobe timing and lengths, so you can adjust the position of best clarity and the overall clarity, although honestly the difference between 100 and 10 for clarity is very hard to spot. Using the default strobe timing, the middle section was clearest and the bottom was slightly blurrier, although the range to which you get good clarity is generally excellent. Now, a non-strobed 540Hz image does look great, but it can't beat a strobed 360Hz image, so the best image quality will always be found with 540Hz and strobing used at the same time. But the higher refresh rate option is more flexible, as you can choose to use strobing at a fixed refresh or get the still excellent clarity on offer at a variable refresh near 540Hz. Opting to not use strobing could be the better choice if you can't consistently hit 500 FPS, as strobing only really works well when the refresh rate and frame rate are matched. Input latency with the PG248QP is elite, offering just below a 1 millisecond processing delay in conjunction with a super high refresh rate and fast response times. This gives the PG248QP excellent responsiveness along with an overall low latency experience, matching the fastest OLEDs, which gain an advantage due to their elite response times. We're talking about less than 5 milliseconds of total latency, which is incredibly good. Power consumption is nothing amazing at 36 watts, which is mostly attributable to the G-Sync module, which is not very efficient. It uses around 12 watts more than the BenQ XL2566K, but less than the PG27AQN as an example. For color quality, you might be surprised to discover this panel is wide gamut, supporting 95% coverage of DCI-P3 and an overall 70% coverage of Rec 2020. This isn't the widest gamut, it's pretty much the minimum sort of coverage needed for a proper wide gamut experience, but it does provide one where the XL2566K and several other 1080p monitors do not. Factory color performance is decent. Grayscale Delta E's could be a little tighter, but overall pretty reasonable, while saturation and color checker results are excellent as the monitor uses sRGB gamut emulation for SDR content by default. This prevents oversaturation from the factory, so generally the image quality is pretty accurate compared to most other gaming monitors. And you'll see that in these charts. The PG248QP is above average for grayscale from the factory and one of the best monitors for color checker. So despite offering a TN panel and being primarily geared towards esports gamers, Asus are still ensuring the visual experience is decent from the factory. This monitor also offers full control over white balance and other settings in the sRGB mode and allows you to switch between sRGB and wide gamut using the OSD settings. This allowed me to tighten up performance slightly using hardware controls. However, for the best experience, you'll need to perform a full software calibration. I used CalMan for this and the results were pretty good, as the panel has full coverage of sRGB and was generally well calibrated from the factory. I wouldn't recommend it for color accurate wide gamut work, but even for the occasional bit of wide gamut viewing, it isn't terrible. Brightness is very good at 420 nits after calibration, which is in the ballpark of most other 1080p monitors, though notably better than the XL2566K. With backlight strobing enabled, you'll get just over 300 nits with the longest pulse width and around 30 nits at the shortest pulse and 150 nits with the middle 50 setting. The XL2566K does 330 nits strobed, so either way there is enough brightness here whether strobed or not strobed. Minimum brightness of 41 nits is pretty good as well. Contrast is surprisingly good from this TN monitor. My unit hit 1376:1, which is 26% higher than the BenQ monitor we've been comparing it to, and it's an all-round great number from a non-VA LCD panel. Black levels aren't especially dark, and of course to get this result you'll need to view the panel dead on, but you won't be getting a contrast disadvantage just because it's a TN monitor. The biggest downside to image quality from this panel are the viewing angles, which are horrible. You really have to view this display dead on to get a good experience. Any slight off-axis viewing angle in the horizontal or vertical direction leads to a significant gamma and brightness shift, leading to a really washed out image. Colors are also affected at off angles. This is where a TN panel can look very bad next to an IPS or other type of LCD, as you can view an IPS from a slightly off axis angle and still get a great experience, whereas a TN looks comparatively terrible under the same circumstances. So make sure your setup is optimized where you are viewing the panel exactly in that very narrow viewing angle sweet spot. Outside of viewing angle issues, uniformity is reasonable, certainly good enough for gaming, and when viewed optimally, you shouldn't see too much backlight bleed. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Asus generally advertise this monitor pretty well, although including HDMI 2.0 instead of 2.1 is annoying. The color performance specs are pretty good, although advertising a 0.2 millisecond response time is a bit misleading despite this being a very fast panel, as on average the display is more like 2 milliseconds. The lack of backlight strobing support below 360Hz also lets it down. Asus also bizarrely advertised this as being HDR capable with display HDR 400 support, even though I don't think any esports gamer buying this panel would actually care about HDR at all. It really doesn't support HDR, as it doesn't support any form of local dimming. Yeah, you can turn it on, but you get a very low contrast ratio for HDR and weak brightness. However, I didn't spot any issues or defects with the panel, as generally the panel quality is quite good. Overall, the Asus ROG Swift Pro PG248QP is one of those monitors that really impresses me due to one specific aspect, and that's its motion clarity. This is the first 540Hz display that I've used, and Let me tell you, 540Hz is a joy both in responsiveness and smoothness. This monitor is remarkably clear when gaming at its highest refresh rate, and I continue to be surprised every time I test out a new, even higher refresh rate at how much impact going higher can have. A lot of people would say that we're in diminishing returns territory here, but I'm not so sure. The differences compared to 360Hz were noticeable for me, and even more significant compared to 240Hz, which many people would say is a very high refresh rate today. On top of having a very high refresh rate, the PG248QP has the fastest response times I've measured on an LCD panel. It's quite a bit faster than prior leaders in this category like the BenQ XL2566K, and it offers an excellent, fast, low overshoot experience at all refresh rates. It's plenty fast enough to handle 540Hz, it's elite at lower refresh rates, and it has low input latency as well. Only OLED panels are faster right now, and while there is a bit of a gap to bridge there in response times, current OLEDs max out at 240Hz and you simply get better motion clarity from a 540Hz LCD. Asus complements this with ULMB2, which on this 540Hz panel delivers the best motion clarity I've seen, meaning the PG248QP takes the crown for both strobed and non-strobed clarity. This feature is let down a little by not supporting lower refresh rates like 240Hz or 144Hz, but I suspect anyone buying this sort of display will be doing so with the goal of playing at or above 500 FPS, which, yes, is possible in some multiplayer games, provided you have powerful PC hardware. I was also pleasantly surprised by some aspects to image quality, including its good contrast ratio, wide gamut support, and great factory calibration. However, a lot of the time this is nullified by awful viewing angles, an ever-present characteristic of TN panels. Unless you are viewing this display dead on in the very small sweet spot, you're likely to experience a more washed out image, so it's hard to recommend it for anything other than its speed and motion performance. While the image clarity here was certainly impressive, to me the PG248QP is more of a tech demo and look towards the future of display technologies, because at $900 US it's basically impossible to recommend to the average gamer. Even for someone after a premium esports monitor with plenty of cash to spend, it's hard to justify $900 on this. That is a very, very high price to pay and ultimately consigns it to a niche offering. I do think it's better than the BenQ XL2566K, but the BenQ is only $600 US, itself a very high price for a 1080p monitor in 2023, and for gamers looking to play using backlight strobing, the PG248QP is only slightly clearer. In my opinion, the PG248QP should be priced no more than where the XL2566K is today, with the BenQ offering shuffling down in price. That would probably tempt a portion of the esports crowd to consider it. At $900 US though, enjoy this look into what will come in the future, but perhaps wait for that future to arrive rather than jumping in right now. Anyway, that's it for this look at this Asus 540Hz monitor. Certainly if this sort of technology comes to, say, 1440p IPS panels or even OLED monitors, then that would definitely get me to upgrade my monitor to 540Hz. Simply running games at this refresh rate is excellent. But for now, I think, yeah, some of those downsides to the TN panel means that I probably won't be considering it. And of course the price as well. If you are interested in this monitor or any of the others that we've talked about in this review, we do have links to those in the description below, so check those out down below. And also you can support us directly there via our Patreon or Floatplane links. Head there, you get access to some cool benefits, Discord community, monthly live streams, ICC profiles, lots of good stuff there. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.